If you would, turn to Mark chapter 10. We'll get there in a little bit. Well, very much same paradigm of outline that we did last week. The God who asks questions. And we talked about God Father last week, and we're going to talk about Jesus this week. If you really read the Gospels in their entirety, you'll find that one way to look at them would be to see that questions that Jesus asks people really frame the Gospels. I'll ask you to see if you answer this question correctly. The first words recorded by Jesus in the Gospel of Luke are a question. First time he talks in Luke, it's a question. Do you remember what the question is? Luke chapter 2 and verse 49. That probably didn't help, did it? No. Yes. You're close. That's the second thing he said. What's the first thing he said? Why are you looking for me? Remember that? Why are you looking for me? And then he said, don't you think I should be about my Father's business or my Father's house? So the first words that Jesus speaks in the Gospel of John is a question. Do you remember what it is? John 1:38, don't do it, cheaters. John 1:38 is the two disciples, what do you seek when they approached Jesus? Because John the Baptizer told them to. What do you seek? Now, if you look again, some of his first words in two major Gospels are questions. All right? How about some of his last words? What are some of the last words he ever said in his life? Do you remember? What would you think? Do you remember them all? Yes. My God, why have you forsaken me? Father, that's a question, right? Yeah, that's not a question, but it's a good one, right? How about this? So my God, why have you forsaken me? And then let's go a little further. So the beginning of his life started with questions. On the end of his life, it was all about questions. And we already know, because we're going to do everything in between tonight, you know everything in between was all about questions. But how about after he was resurrected? What were some of the questions he said to people in John and Luke? Do you remember any of them? Who are you looking for, right? The angels asked a question. Why are you looking for the living among the dead? What else? He asked Mary Magdalene what question? Why are you weeping? And then Craig said, who are you looking for? And then when he appeared to the disciples, what did he ask them for? Yes, Peter 3 times. Do you love me? Same question over and over again. So when he appears to them and the door is shut and he comes right through, he asked them a very simple question, which you think Jesus wouldn't even ask it, but he had a reason for it, you know. What did he say to them? Do you have any fish? Do you have anything to eat? So he asked questions. All along, what did he ask the people that were walking, the two people among the Emmaus Road, down the Emmaus Road in Luke 24? What did he ask them when he approached them, even though they didn't know it was him? What did he say? Why are you sad? What are you talking about as you walk along the road? So could you see what I'm saying? You could frame out the Gospels, Jesus' first words, his last words, everything in between, even after he's risen from the dead. You have to understand, don't you, as you read the Gospels, Jesus liked to ask questions. He liked to ask a lot of questions. In fact, I read an author who put them into 6 categories, and we're not going to go through them, but he said, he asked questions to challenge the assumptions that you think you know what you're talking about. He gave questions about giving people hope and questions about the Word of God. He had questions that were redemptive and compassion when he wanted people to believe in him. He had lessons that would make be confrontational, and he would ask people questions to drive them to the place where they have to make a choice in their life and what road they're going to walk down, his or someone else's. He confronted the way people thought and the things that he did. I read an author this week that said, well, where did Jesus get this rabbinical? And Conrad was right. It is not just Jesus as a rabbi who did that, but he was the one that we obviously look at. But foundational to Jewish parenting and education, in which I wish I would have read all these things earlier in my life. I would have asked my kids a lot of questions. They probably didn't like the ones I already did ask them. But Luke 2:46, Jesus is found by his parents in the temple when he's 12. He got left behind. They come back and they find him in the temple, and they're a little miffed at him. And they ask him, why will you do this to us? And when they found him, though, what did it say that he was doing? He was sitting with the scholars, right? And what was he doing? Yeah, no, don't miss this. He was asking them questions. If you sit down, right, and it's called a shivard, if you sit down and do serious study with scholars, you are not, as a 12-year-old person, you never ask questions. You're the receiver, you're the learner, because you're only 12, and these men are 30 or older, right? But what do you find him? He's asking them questions, and it says they're astonished by that. So here's a young boy, we know who he is, 12 years old, asking questions that even the religious leaders then couldn't grasp. So he's been asking questions even when he was little. And even his parents and the religious leaders couldn't always get them. But when you ask questions, again, J.R. Briggs, where I got a lot of the material from, he said this: when you meet Jesus, you don't have a Q&A, you have a Q and a Q. Because you don't get to, he doesn't answer. In fact, I think I said this last week, 179 questions were asked Jesus, and he directly answered 4 of them. So if you had a conversation and asked him a question, i.e. the question, if you had one and he'd have to answer, he'd probably answer it with a question. And just to give you an example, if you read rabbinic literature, we would say today, here's a question: what is 2 plus 2? And they would never, ever, a rabbi would never say 4. He would never give you that. He would say, what is 16 divided by 4? That's how they would answer, because they are into making you think from all angles in all kinds of different ways. So all the questions he has, there are 1,090 questions in the Bible. 600 of them are in the Gospels. Gospel John has the most by any stretch. So if you really want to get all into Jesus' questions, you'd ask that. Again, I said earlier, let me go back to it. If you could ask any question you wanted of Jesus, what would you ask? Now, I'm going to add on to that thought. If you were thinking in your mind tonight, but you didn't answer what question you would ask, let me tell you what it means. And this is part of the power and influence of questions that would really be good for us to get down. I think when you ask the questions, it is demonstrating what really matters to you. So keep that in your mind, because that's our main thought tonight. When you have a question and you ask it to someone, it reveals what your true desires are. So our questions give us a glimpse into what we think about him. So if we ask questions about God, or we ask about life or things in it, we're also revealing about what we think about him. And as A.W. Tozer said, the most important thing about you is what you think and believe about God. In our book that we turn to, Mark chapter 10, if you'll look there, I want to spend some time, the remaining time, about answering that question. And you could ask another great question, and we won't do it tonight. What do you think the greatest question that Jesus ever asked was? I read numerous people, but a lot of them came down with this twofold question that was back to back. Jesus asked his disciples at one point, who do people think that I am? And they said that was the second most important question. But to them that day, and to us, it's more personal. The second time he says, but who do you think that I am? And the writer I read said, that's the most important question that you'll ever be asked. Who do you think Jesus is? And I want to develop that question by these two questions in the Gospel of Mark. So if you're there, let me read the text with you. Mark chapter 10, verse 35. And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him and said to him, mark it down, that every use of James and John in the book of Mark always have Peter with it. It's always James, John, and Peter, except this one. And I'm going to show you why. James and John come to him and said, teacher, it's just another way of saying rabbi. We want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. They want to get a blank check from Jesus. I want you to do whatever. It's like rub the genie and he'll come out and give you whatever you want. And he said to them, here's his question. What do you want me to do for you? If you take notes on paper or in your Bible, circle that verse 36 and that question. And then go over, if you would, to the next paragraph up there in front of them, and they understand the glory. So when they say, hey, we want these thrones in your glory, they're not meaning go to heaven someday and sit in your glory. They're talking about the glory of his earthly kingdom. When he sets up his kingdom, they say, you're the Christ, and here's what we want. We want on your right hand and on your left. Now, if you want someone on the right hand, left, right hand is the number one seat of honor. So if you went to the Lord's Supper and looked at that passage, you'll know that it's quite strange that on Jesus' right hand in the place of honor, right, was Judas. And on his left hand was John. That's how the table, which was a triclinium table, which was low to the ground with pillows all the way around it, and that's how they would. But if you put someone on your right hand and left, you're asking, saying, hey, Jesus, your number one advisor and your number two advisor, the guys that are most important in your kingdom outside of you, that's who we want to be. Now, why would they ask that question? Other passages that are parallel to this one in the Gospels say their mother came. Now, their mother was his relative. And so that you put a little bit of push in there. You bring your mom with you, and your mom's related to him, and we have a better chance of getting what we want. But why did they ask the question? Because they thought they knew who he was. And they thought they knew what the kingdom was about, but they didn't. You see, they thought the kingdom was about power, and they thought leadership was about using your authority to your own advantage. And the only time they ever leave Peter out of a discussion is when there's only two chairs that are available, and he's the third. So they leave him out. That's how powerful. Now, it's no wonder in the text and other parallel versions that it says the other 10 disciples got very angry at that, as you can imagine. Probably because they beat him to the punch. They probably would have thought of it. They would have done it first, and they would have been pretty happy. But James and John were on top of it a little bit more. And it says, Jesus said to them, you don't know what you're asking. In other words, you're asking questions to me that are completely wrong because you don't know really who I am and you don't know my kingdom. And I wonder, do we do that? Do we ever ask God questions for things in our lives? Do this for me, have this. And we just really ask him, but we are not considering who he is. Not really what he's all about and how he thinks about those things. And we're not really considering his kingdom. We really ask a lot of questions about our kingdom because we're living lives that are really characterized by powering over instead of powering under. And of course, Jesus says to them, you don't know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup, which is Jesus' metaphorical way of saying, we're going to have a table pretty soon, the Last Supper, and I'm going to drink a cup. And the third one in the four of the cups that are there is the cup of wrath, and I'm going to drink it. Do you think that you can really follow me and drink my cup? And the answer is they won't be able to at this point. And he says, will you be able to be baptized? Will you be able to handle the overwhelming flood and deluge of God's judgment and condemnation on me like I'm going to bear it on the cross? And the answer is no. But you know what they say? We are able. And I'll have to give them a little bit because they're pretty courageous to say that they were that committed to Jesus. But the truth was they were far from it. It wasn't just Peter who overestimated his commitment to Jesus. I'll go to prison and to death. It was him. And you know why? because they were so locked in on their own agenda that they really thought that they'd be willing to do anything to get it. Even if they were martyred in the final military battle, they knew that they'd be raised from the dead, and they thought that's really what it was all about. So they wanted honor, they wanted prestige, they wanted glory. And that's not what it was all about at all. And Jesus says, after they say, we are able, he says, will you drink my cup, be baptized with my baptism? He says, verse 40, but to sit at my right hand or my left is not mine to grant. And isn't it amazing that if you read the book of Mark in its entirety, that the two people, by the way, Jesus' cross was his coronation. That's how he became king. And you know the people on his right hand, on his left, who were they? Two thieves. He says, if you want to have that, this is what you'll have to do. Because to sit on in my kingdom, on my right and left, you have to first have a cross before you have a crown. And so he says to them, do you understand a little bit more about my kingdom? And when the 10 heard it, they began to be indignant at James and John. And Jesus called them. Now, catch this. This is what he's talking about. He wants to call them aside. He's going to give them a discipleship lesson. Now, remember context always matters. Before our paragraph is the third of 3 passion narratives. Mark has 3 of them where Jesus stops and tells his disciples, and he uses very similar language in all of those. He'll talk about being killed. He'll talk about being beaten. He'll talk about raising on the 3rd day. And a lot of the language is similar. And this is the third one. This is the third one about telling them, listen, you think I'm going to have this kingdom and you're going to share my glory. How many times do I have to tell you I'm going to die on the cross? And we go like, yeah, what is wrong with them? How many times do they have to hear it? He says it so plainly, and they just don't get it. And they don't live like it because they don't get it. And I wonder, what is wrong with us? How many times have we heard the message that Jesus is all about a cross? And it's not only his cross, it's our cross. And how much do we tell him, this is his kingdom? It's not about power, it's about weakness. It's not about powering over, it's about powering under. Mark 10:45, smack dab in the middle of this next context, is Jesus says, I didn't come to be served. I came to serve and to give my life. I didn't come to take lives. I came to give my life for people. That's the kingdom I have. But they never get it. So much so that the whole framework of chapter 10 and verses 40 through 45, can you see it? Look at chapter 10 and verse 40. Here's the thing, if you're taking notes, he does this little formula, not this, but this. Verse 40, he says, but to those who at my right hand and my left hand, it's not mine to give, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared. Not this. I'm not going to tell you you're getting it because God knows that. It's not this, but this. Verse 43. He says, but it shall not be so among you, but whoever would be great among you must be your servant. Not this, but this. Verse 45. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. Do you see what he's doing in 5 verses? Over and over, he's saying this. Disciples, not this. You got it wrong. Not this, this. Not this, this. You have it backwards. Completely backwards. And he says, let me tell you how this applies to you in true discipleship, what it looks like. James and John's view of discipleship is, I get connected to Jesus and I go up the ladder. I'm on the right and the left. I can be as high as I can and it'll be the greatest thing that ever happened to me. And Jesus says, you don't even know what discipleship is. Even though you followed me for 3 years, you don't get it. Here's what he says. Listen very carefully. He says, and Jesus called to them, verse 42, you know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles, i.e., 2 types of leadership, worldly ones, kingdom ones. He says, you know they're considered rulers. They lord it over them, And their great ones exercise authority over them. It's the kata prefix in the word, which means this. It means they have authority and they use it to get over people. They power and they use people to get what they want. And they says, see, that's not leadership. James and John, you can't use me. You can't use me to get what you want. That's not true discipleship. But it shall, see, right? Not this. Verse 43, but 5 words. Not, here's how it would be in the original. Not it among you. Not it among you. In other words, that's how everybody else in the world, that's how they view life. That's how they use leadership. That's how they use authority, but not us. And my question is, why? Why do we admire people in authority in our world that are lost? Why? Why do we get enamored with celebrities and what they have to say about issues when they are as pagan as it possibly could be? Why do we care about athletes? Because they can play a sport well and make all kind of money, but when they say something about what's going on in our culture, why would we even listen to them? Why do we care about really rich billionaires in the business world and how they think about things and how they look at why? Why do we admire, follow politicians? Why? It makes no sense. You know why? They are power over people. They use money, they use authority, and they have an agenda. There's power under isn't even a consideration. There is no serving, there is no giving your life for them, out of them. Not at all. And the rest of the text, you can see beginning in verse 46, let me tie it in. And they came to Jericho, and he was leaving Jericho with his disciples, a great crowd. Bartimaeus, blind beggar, son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside. Circle it on your, here's the notes. This text begins and ends with a little phrase, and it's really key. He was sitting by the roadside. It's by the way, hadas. It means simply that, the way, the road. And at the end of it, it says, verse 52, go your way, your faith has made you well. And immediately he recovered his sight and followed him, same exact phrase, on the road. So he's on this road at the beginning, and by the time the end of the paragraphs, he's on a completely different note. Completely different direction, completely different. He has faith when he didn't have faith at all. He was blind, now he can see. His life is changed. Why does it matter? What is the story about? Why did Mark put the story about James and John and the next story about blind Bartimaeus? Why were they back to back? Why is the question Jesus asked both of them the same? What would you have me to do for you? Because we're supposed to see this. This is what discipleship is. And here's what it is not. Blind Bartimaeus knows Jesus is passing by, and notice what he cries out to him. And he says it multiple times, and he has to be silenced, or people are trying to, but he won't shut up. But he says, what? Jesus, son of David. Who was that? Messiah. You see, the disciples walked with the Messiah. They didn't know who he really was and what he was all about. This blind man who cannot see, and you'll know more than physically, this man couldn't see physically, and the disciples couldn't see spiritually. But he knows this is Son of David. And watch, knowing that Jesus is the Messiah, James and John ask for what? Military power. They want exaltation. That's what they want. What does the blind man ask for when asked the same question? He doesn't ask for sitting on his right hand and on his left. And he knows the same stories that James and John do about what the Messiah would be. You know what he asks for? Not might, but mercy. James and John are up here, and the blind man is down here. And here's what Jesus says. You know what true discipleship is? It's starting down here, because it's not up. I'm not heading this way when I follow Jesus. I'm heading this way. I'm not trying to get as high as I can, i.e., thrones on the right hand and on the left. I'm trying to get as low as I can, i.e., like Jesus as a servant. And he says, this is true discipleship. To follow Jesus, you've got to drop your pride. You've got to drop your self-agenda. You have to drop the fact that you have to stand up always for your own rights and that you're trying to get things done in your own way, on your own terms for yourself. And he asks him, what do you want me to do for you? And he says, I just want you to have mercy on me. In the true discipleship, that's where it always starts. I want you to do for me what I really need the most. I need you to work on me and in me. Not give me this. Do this for me. Blind Bartimaeus calls Jesus Rabbi. Did you see it? Rabboni. Isn't that what James and John would say they would call him? Isn't it amazing that they say the same thing, they ask the same question, but their answers are completely different? And when the blind man is changed, what's the first thing he does? He follows Jesus on the road. And by the way, in all the Gospels, the road is the road that's leading to Jerusalem and crucifixion. And you're supposed to understand it that way. In other words, this guy says, I know who you are, and I know what you can do. And I'm not looking for military, I'm looking for mercy. And it changed his life. Changed his life. And he followed Jesus. We don't know how that ended for him. But we know it changed his life. And it started with one question from Jesus. I would love to hear testimonies and stories down the road of people who would say, you know what? I was changed because somebody asked me this question. I was changed and I got saved. I was changed and I became a disciple. I got asked this one question, and my whole idea of following Jesus and serving him and powering over, I have this now. I have a different view of it. I see what I'm supposed to be like, and I want to follow him. And when he got up to follow Jesus, it says he got up and left his garment on the ground. The garment he probably put his little bucket on where people would come by and give him alms. The idea is this: when you pick up your garments and leave them, you are starting a new life. You're leaving your old one behind. Would to God that we would do that tonight. For people who think we've got it down about what Jesus was all about, but in our lives, we don't. If Jesus came to you tonight, let me say it one more time, and he asked, what would you want me to do for you? What would you have really said? What would come to your mind first? Because you know what questions are? They reveal. They reveal what we really want. They reveal what we truly think about Jesus and his kingdom. What question would you ask? What question would you answer? Let's pray. Father, help us. Your kingdom is a paradox. It's the opposite on almost every area and level to what our culture thinks. And yet we believe it, but we struggle living it so much, so often. Help us, Lord. Help us to see what true leadership is. It's really servant leadership. It's not going up, it's going down. It's not about crowns first, it's about crosses. It's about dying to ourselves and living for others. Oh, Father, help us to understand the kingdom because we understand you. We understand what you're about and what you want our lives to be about and how that we should live out these truths that we might have true discipleship. Now, Father, may we discard our agendas. May we discard our own primacy and help us to get little and low and humble, that we might be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath, because it is our desire not to have our way, but to learn yours. May we follow on the road that way as we walk behind you. In Jesus' name, amen.